Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. For our final episode covering Black Mirror's USS Callister into Infinity, we welcome composer Daniel Pemberton. Daniel will talk us through the challenges and creative decisions made in creating the score for the sequel episode. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Daniel. Hi Daniel, thank you for joining me today.
All right, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to sit down and talk to you. I have to admit, one of your soundtracks basically saved my life when I was driving in the hills. Because if it wasn't for that intense music, I don't think I would have been concentrating on the road. Well, I was basically off road, and one little minor to like move to the left, I probably would have fallen off a cliff. So if it wasn't
Okay,
for
well,
that,
what soundtrack was that?
I'd man across the Spider-Verse.
Okay, all right, well, I'm pleased that I must be being alone.
Well, and it was also my wedding day, so it was like, yeah, it could have been a
Okay,
double whammy.
wedding man across the paradise on your wedding day. That I don't know if it's a good wedding or a bad wedding, but
It was
anyway,
incredible. Let's just put it that way. But we're here to talk about Black Mirror USS Callister into Infinity, which has just come out recently on Netflix. How have you found the reception to the episode?
I don't know. It's kind of weird these days. Like, I'm not really on social media, so I'm kind of on whatever Twitter is now, which is a total shit show. And so, unless you want to see people punching each other in the face or hearing how great Elon Musk is, it's not a very good place to actually get any feedback. And so it's kind of like almost going back to the old days where it's like, I don't know, do people like the music I did? So I don't know. I haven't really had much feedback on it, but then that's probably because I hide under a rock most of the time.
I guess that way, like, either you get a nice sort of vibe of like, do you know what? Either no one will say anything bad, no one will say anything good. I've done my bit. I can walk off into the sunset.
Well, I think one of the things actually that's quite important for me is kind of I don't really care what other people think. Like I care what I think, and if I think it's good, then that's the most important audience in some ways. And obviously, it's really nice if other people think it's good, and if they think it's crap, well, then that's opinion. If they think it's crap and I know it's crap, then that's hard because you're like, they're right. But being a film composer, you have to have very, very thick skin. So you kind of just keep going. And I was like, I'm really proud of what we did on that show. I feel I wanted to make something that felt as exciting and as big as a full scale feature film, which I think Toby Haynes, the director, wanted to do as well, and everyone else involved with it. And I kind of feel, we got something really, really exciting there that feels like, huge and cinematic for an episode of Black Mirror, which, Black Mirror is always very cinematic and engrossing, but they rarely embrace that sort of scale. And of course, I get the episode that has to embrace that scale, which means it's the most complicated, time consuming head fuck of an episode. But those are the things I get excited about.
This is probably going to be such a loaded question, it'd be so difficult to ask. But how do you decide if something is good or if you're happy with it? Because you'll be, as a composer, just like an actor, director, DOP, producer, you're putting so much of yourself into your work that I can imagine that sometimes you might wake up in the middle of the night and be like, do you know what? That was not right. I'm going to go back and tweak just this little bit.
Well, yes, I'd say the hardest thing is not me going back and tweaking. It's like having your stuff cut, chopped, mixed really quietly. And that happened kind of almost on every film. So you kind of learn to live with your disappointments. I mean, I could run you through so many examples of every movie I've done where there was something I did better that didn't make the final film. But that's kind of the process of being a composer in a way. But genuinely, with that USS Callister, I don't think there's anything in there that I'm unhappy about, which is quite rare for me in terms of how the whole episode feels and sounds. And I had a really nice, Toby Haynes, director, I'm very tight with. Charlie, I'm tight with, and the sound team did a great mix and a respectful mix, which also makes a big difference. They really pushed the music in places, so that really helps you experience it more.
Because I've spoken to sound designers and sound mixers, and I will do ask the question about how you don't have a fight with composers in terms of trying to take the soundscape. But when you're working on something like this, where it's going to have to be epic because we're out in space, we have some of those dogfights, we have a mixture of also being in the real world. When you're creating the soundtrack and needing sort of big bombastic beats and sounds, how do you sort of create that? And then in the back of your mind, are you thinking about the sound design of the show as well?
Well, I mean, it's a good question because it is definitely one of the sort of complex factors in films where you are often on a soundstage where the sound mixer to one side has the sound team who are often people they work with all the time who've put an insane amount of work into what they've done. And the other side, you have the music person and the music team who've also put a insane amount of work into what they've done. But these people who've done the sound team, they have to see each other in the office the next day and all week. So I think there's a sort of often a kind of unconscious bias that pushes people towards the sound, and it is, for me, it always comes down to storytelling. So it's like, is the sound, sound team did great work on this, and it's like, what is the sound telling you? I always try and write so there's space for sound. I try and make sure, on a really tight project, you're hopefully communicating with the sound team about where one thing goes and where another thing goes. And it's like, if you have a really, really full mix, you don't take anything in. It's a bit like, if you think of like a Marvel movie, right? Like when they have these massive battles with 27 million things going on at screen, you sort of almost don't actually take anything in. You just kind of go, oh, there's a lot of stuff going on. But emotionally, you're disconnected often because there is so much happening. So your brain's taking in all this information. And it's the same with sound and music. If there's too much sound and too much music, you don't know what to concentrate on. And sometimes that can be good if you need a sense of disorientation or like extremity. But what is really interesting, I just remember watching a Lord of the Rings, like, I don't know, a couple of years ago. I was watching this scene, I was thinking, oh my God, there's so little sound in this. There's just some wind and some horses' hooves and some horse noises and the score. And then that's why the score has so much space to breathe, and it helps you with the emotion and the storytelling. And sound effects can do an amazing job of storytelling. If you're hearing you're on a bridge and you can hear it creaking, you're like, oh my God, this bridge is unsafe, or a bullet flies past and it sounds absolutely like lethal, it can make it seem more scary. But it's like you have to find ways to balance between those two worlds into what will give the most powerful emotion, I think. And when you put big sound effects on stuff, everything always feels more sexy and exciting. But I think good directors understand the power of music and carving space out for it, which is definitely what we had on USS Callister.
It's interesting though, isn't it, right? That like you have those two groups, the music composer and then the sound team, and that you're sort of not, I wouldn't say like fighting, but it's like a bit of a clash of the titans of like how are we going to
Well,
put certain things
I
in.
get it. It's difficult. I've done, I'll do cues, and I've done loads of work on them. They might want to pull some things out, and then I've done loads of work on stuff. And so no one likes sort of having their time wasted, so to speak. And sound teams always generally have to start with more because you need the options to pull things out. But it is, you've got to have the right vibe and atmosphere on the soundstage. Like I just did a film called Bad Guys 2, DreamWorks, and just fantastic. A mixer called Julian Slater, just really great attitude. Works with the composer, works with the director, works with the sound team, and we got an amazing, really exciting, dynamic mix out of that has these amazing moments of music, but also amazing moments of sound. These big sequences, and we're moving between them, and I think when people think of a great score in a film, often what they're really talking about is the director played the music loudly. Because you're amazed how many great scores there are, but you just don't really hear them because they're buried under stuff, or they're not given the prominence that can make them connect with people.
And also, like, music and sound has such a different way of speaking to audiences because our brains are so wired differently compared to like a visual medium, right? And I feel like sometimes if you have someone who doesn't understand like sound design and score, then yeah, you can be quite lost with what's going on or just how you should feel in certain scenes.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, it's interesting how modern film composing has got more and more closer to a kind of sound design element over the last couple of decades. I mean, it's different for every project, but the lines are getting more blurry between, let's say, sound design and scoring.
Yeah, which is kind of scary because you could lose one and of the other in what they do, and sometimes maybe whoever's composing could lose some of their creativity.
I think it's really is like whether you're doing something that is distinctive enough. So you can do, really interesting stuff with, I like trying to make motifs that have, if you look at Spider-Verse, like the Prowler sound or 2099, they're very distinctive sort of noises, but they're, in some ways more sound designy than conventional melodic writing that you'd have in an orchestra. And I think the thing that's fun about this Black Mirror is I get to do a bit of both. There's like sort of conventional, big, epic orchestral writing, and then there's also like sort of quite modern, electronics and electronic sound design.
When it comes to writing music that's like orchestral and then going to that sort of more electronic, do you change the process in the way that you think? Because with orchestral, there's more pieces to it in terms of how many strings or horns or that will
Yeah,
be
I mean
there.
the the process is they've both got strengths and weaknesses. And the thing that's interesting about orchestral stuff is you can be melodically a lot more complex and a lot richer and a lot sort of more nimble. And I'd say it's harder to do that with electronic stuff that's purely electronic. Like purely electronic stuff often feels, once you start moving out of stuff, if you start doing electronic stuff that changes keys or is very melodic, it starts to stick out in a way that doesn't happen so much with orchestral music. So you write differently for anything. A violin has got this much space and the basses are down here or something. And with a synth, you might have all this, or there might only be one good sound up here. So you just kind of, you play around with what you've got and what you can do. I like playing in both. I mean, I like playing in any world that I can do music in, really, and just trying to find, how I can get something feeling new and different.
When you speak of new and different, because this is technically the first sequel in the Black Mirror universe, and you're coming
Yeah.
back to score the episode, do you feel that how do you go about scoring the episode to make sure that it's different enough from previous one, but then you also want to maybe pepper in certain motifs or sort of previous sounds into the score?
Yeah, well, with this, we've got obviously like the USS Callister theme, which in the first one, ba 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 ba, which is kind of like basically a play on the idea of like Star Trek and films like that, sort of triumphant brass, sort of fanfare kind of idea. But this one's a lot darker, and that sort of major key triumph doesn't work very well in this environment. So you're sort of like, okay, let's put it in a minor key, and you're trying to do things that make them feel connected, so they're not two totally separate things. But you want it to feel new and different. So one of the things we used a lot is I used a lot of the synth sounds that I'd programmed for the first one, which have sort of a very distinctive tone, and so you can hear them, or certain chords. There's certain chords I use which are like it's like a D minor with an addition. What is it? It's like a D minor with an additional nine, and that's got a sound that you hear it and it's very recognizable to show. Likewise, some of the other sort of electronic effects, and then you can add some new things, and it's a bit like a color palette and just adding new colors into it, but trying to keep the aesthetics similar so it feels like a continuation rather than a reinvention. But then you've got lots more elements. You got there's like that forest sort of planet. You got these ice planet. The scale is definitely bigger in this one, so you want to reflect that in the score as well.
When it comes to scale as well, because there's, as audiences, it's easy for us to see it visually, but then how do you produce that in the score? Because you could probably try maybe add a few more sort of drums or horns to certain areas, or do you, or even like with a synth, you can maybe play around a bit more. But how do you what like create the sonic sound for it to make so that audience can feel it like in their chests?
Well, in Callister, it starts very, very big over the opening with the big logo. Then we sort of pull you down, and then we get to like the sort of modern office world. And so the office world, the stakes are not as high; they're more kind of internalized, and the music in some ways gets smaller. It gets more sort of minimal synths. And as the show builds, it gets bigger and bigger. And the thing that was difficult was like by the end, we have these huge space battles that are like something out of Star Wars, where you've got this like really kind of intense, slightly over the top orchestral music. And I've got to get from here to there without it feeling like a huge style change. Because if I put that stuff that's over the crazy space battles at the end earlier on, it's just going to feel ridiculous. So one of the key cues that does that is a thing called mass invite, which is when Walton invites every person to come fight the Callister crew. And that is like this slow building up track that has elements of electronics you've heard before, but then we bring the orchestra in. And the orchestra is starting off quite, the writing is sort of more elegiac and like slightly more minimal and building until it explodes into the kind of huge space battle stuff. But I'm very conscious of like this movement into that last act and it feeling like a big tempo change and a big sort of gear change, but without it feeling like this music's come out of nowhere.
It's interesting though that thinking about like the tempo change and how your music enters a scene and also sort of exits a scene. Again, that's down to you and your team, and also the post team being able to sort of knowing when to insert it and when to sort of ramp it up as well.
I'd
Um,
say a big part of being a composer, I think, is storytelling and learning how you come in, how you go out. Sometimes you want to creep in. I liken it to being a party, right? You're a party. Sometimes you just want to sneak in and like just sort of hide in the corner a bit and chat to some people in the kitchen, and then maybe make your way into the main bit. Other times you might want to kick the door in and be like, party. And music is a bit like that. And sometimes you want to tell everyone you're leaving the party, and slowly make your way out, or sometimes you just want to boom, I'm out of there, explode in a puff of smoke. And I think scoring is quite a lot like that. If you come in too hard in a scene that doesn't want it, then it can really be jarring. But if you come in too hard, if you come in really hard on the scene, you can get away with it. It's great because it can be really bold and exciting. But again, you have to measure the film and what's going to be best for the film. What's best for your ego is probably you kicking the door in every time and going, yay, party. But if it's a polite chit chat and someone's talking about, I don't know, their dog has died or something, you're going to look like a dick. So it's better to speak in slowly and work out what they're talking. Are they talking about the dog again? Oh yeah, better keep my mouth shut for a bit, especially as I ran it over.
it's like the cool Kool-Aid guy jumping in at the wrong time, in
Yeah.
Family Guy, something like that. But it's it is sort of fascinating to hear, and then also get a sort of insight into your mind and how you work, but then also the overall structure of composing in film and having a big entrance or a small entrance. And the party analogy is actually really good, and it's like I might steal that.
Like I don't know if you saw the other Black Mirror I did called Bête Noire,
Yes.
but so in that's a great example. There's some cues which are like kicking down the door, like "What's up?" Like huge organ sounds, and then there's stuff which is a lot more discreet and hides under the scenes. And and that's just that score is such an interesting like juxtaposition to Callister because the Bête Noire score is probably one of those minimal scores I've ever done in the sense the whole thing was just done on one organ Whereas Callister was done on like a 70-piece orchestra, a million synthesizers, loads of sound design, percussion, everything. And I like being able to do things where you can just approach it in a totally different way every time, and not just do the same old crap you do all the time and just be like, I'll do it for that film.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about Better Noir because I wanted to see what the difference was between composing for something like that compared to
Man,
US
the
Callister.
difference is I did Bet Noir really quickly, and Callister took forever. Like Bet Noir, I had an idea, right? I had an idea for Bet Noir, pitched it to Toby, and I pitched it to Charlie. I was like, if I do both of these, I'm not going to be able to do both of them if they're both really complicated. I've got this idea for Bet Noir. Can I do the whole thing on an organ? I know I can pull it off. Charlie, because they'd put loads of other like music all over Bet Noir from like, films and all this kind of stuff. And it was fine, but it felt like an episode of it made it feel more conventional. And I thought this is a really special film, and it needs something that gives it an identity from the music. And so like I said, let's try this thing with this organ. And Charlie really liked it, and so did Toby. So we were like, great, off we go. Then I kind of almost did that in like hardly any time whatsoever, because there's not much you can do. The idea works. So, and it's like you always got to know if something works, when to walk away. So that I walked away quite quickly. USS Callister took forever. It was the most ambitious, probably one of the most ambitious scores I've done for TV, I think, ever.
Well, for Better Noir, I would say it kind of reminds me a little bit of The Thing, of like like the opening sort of theme of when the
Which
dog
one?
comes. The
Well, that's got the John Carpenter
John
one.
Carpenter one, yeah.
That opening is weird because it sounds like John Carpenter doing the opening, but obviously the music says by Ennio Morricone. So I always thought that was by John. I'm like confused about the opening because you've got that really cool boom,
Yeah.
whatever the bass and drum thing. It's a great opening. And so I always assumed that John Carpenter had just done that track and put it in there, and Morricone had his name on the front. But then I kind of got confused. I was reading something about it, and it was like Morricone did that track that sounds exactly like John Carpenter. So I don't know who did that opening, but it's a great opening. The fact that we can talk about it now, as soon as you say it, I can visualize it and hear it. That's what great film and great film music does.
Yeah, and but then also speaking to someone who does compose music, I think if I mention another film, let's say Titanic, I bet you straight away you could probably think of My Heart Will Go On, for example, or
So you
something
know what I
else.
think of it? I think of if you mention Titanic, I think of the crappy choir sound they use because they ran out of like James Horner. I think like because that film went on forever. They really like had to self-finance that score by the end, and I
Oh
think
wow.
he ended up owning the score as a result. Probably the smartest, luckiest business move of all time. And yeah, there's like if you rehear that score, it's got these really slightly suspect choir like sort of patches in there that haven't stood up as well as they possibly should. But it's part of the charm of the score. And hey, gazillion people love that score, so that's great.
Yeah.
And don't care about dodgy choir patches on synthesizers. But when I hear it, I'm like,
Well, I'm gonna have to listen back to that now and read up on
I'm a
it
guy.
because
I I used to watch the X Files as a kid and get totally wound up that I think it's Mike Snow or Mark Snow had used the presets on a Korg wave station because I had a Korg wave station, and I was shocked that anyone would use a preset on a synthesizer, especially on a show as big as the X Files.
but do you not think that then that goes back to your point about working on something as to make it as simple as possible? Because with X-Files, what is it, 24 or episodes a series or something like that? So there must be like,
Don't confuse simple with like when I said like trying to make Bet Noir simple, it's about having a strong idea and trying to execute it to the highest level that you can. My favorite score is The Third Man, which is all on one instrument, which is the zither, and it's one of the greatest scores of all time. So I've always wanted to do something like that, and I guess Bet Noir's it, but it's no way as good as The Third Man by any stretch whatsoever. But Mark Snow was being lazy. He was getting all those like big X-Files royalties. That guy would have made an absolute, like, you don't even want to know how much money that guy. He could have just programmed his cool waves. I would have programmed it for him. I was like 15 years old. I could program cool wave station like a motherfucker.
Apologies, I didn't mean it simple. I meant more
Yeah.
about your explanation of it. But also going back to USS Callister, there's moments where it's kind of because with sci-fi, it's one of those genres where you can have that mix of like sci-fi and adventure or sci-fi horror and so on. Did you ever think of how the story played out? You could also compose, you can change the way your music's going to sound for each scene. So I think with something like the cut and paste scene where you kind of have that synth side and it's kind of has that sort of like childlike feel to it. And then it sort of starts building up a bit more and a bit more to what the real fear is that it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to grow. I mean, like look, you could score every scene completely differently. And if I'm going to be a bit catty, there's quite a lot of films that do that, where they basically lay in a load of temp music from different movies. They have a big name composer on board who doesn't actually do the work. He farms it out to his assistants. His assistants do the work. They just copy the temp music. And so you get these scores that just sound like they've got no personality. They're just like a bunch of temp music doesn't connect. And I think what I always try and do is to make sure there is a journey through a film, there's a journey through a score, there's a journey through a scene. So, the cut and paste thing, she's slowly working out what's going on with him. And it starts to dawn on her, actually, this guy hasn't changed at all, how horrific it is. And the music really is reflecting her growing realization that she's in big trouble, and also the scale of the situation and the severity of what could happen is growing, like as the scene progresses. And you could have scored it in a totally different way, but it probably wouldn't have felt as effective.
Interesting. I think, again, I guess if you gave it to like five different composers, they would all come out with something different and potentially something that's just like completely different to what you were sort of going for. But then, for my penultimate question, what I'm curious to know about as well, because you've mentioned working with Charlie Brooker and Toby, the director, when they sort of do they sit down and listen to your score before they insert it onto a scene, or do they insert it to a scene and then let it all play out? And then what happens with the discussions afterwards?
Every film was quite different. On this one, I'm trying to think what we did. I would go and score a bunch of scenes, and it was, it's quite an intense turnaround this, because a lot of the battle scenes really need to be scored to picture. So I couldn't kind of pre-write them. Sometimes I can come up with ideas and write them before, shooting, and it sort of goes in. But with stuff like the battle, it had to be so reactive to the picture. So I had to wait really last minute until I got like the kind of locked visual effects. Because if something goes and that is hard on the cut, right? If that cuts suddenly a bit later or a bit earlier, so it goes, you're like, well, that was terrible. Or if it goes, and then the thing changes and you're left with this big empty space, it's not going to work. And a lot of modern music, and I've done this stuff myself, is just where it goes dong, 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 stop. Easy to cut. Just chop that up. The things moved, you can just move it along and it'll work. But if you've got this quite like melodic, sort of like John Williams-esque, not as good as John Williams by any stretch, but trying to do that kind of stuff, it is hard to you in a modern world where people want to chop the whole time, you can't write those scores, which is why you don't really hear those kind of scores. But yeah, I would basically demo stuff, write the scenes. It would be sent to Charlie, it'd be sent to Toby Haynes. They'd watch it and they'd come back with any notes. they were generally pretty good at not giving me many notes, because I think because we've been through this before, there's a level of trust and a sort of, a kind of, what you're doing, but there'll always be notes here and there. And so you try and take those on board. If you think they're a terrible note, you'll tell them, I think that's a terrible note, and you'll have a discussion. You probably won't use that exact phrase, but you'll argue for things you think are going to make the film better. And, that's kind of filmmaking. It's like we all hopefully respect each other's opinions. And, if they've got a note, I might be like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. And you're like, okay, that's what you're trying to do with this scene. And I didn't realize that. So now I'll try and do that. Or it might be like, you're trying to do that with the scene. I've got no idea why you're trying to do that, but I'll go along with it. And it turns out it was a very clever idea. Or it was a dumb idea. And a good film is where everyone has managed to not do the dumb ideas. And I might have some dumb ideas as well. So it's not like I'm totally perfect.
Yeah, but then that's just all part of the filmmaking process and sort of getting your creative ideas out there. And then I think sometimes with creative ideas, sometimes it's easier to get them out there and track back on what's not working compared to maybe not getting all of them out and sort of just sitting on your hands being like, maybe I shouldn't do this or maybe I should.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's good just to do things and worry about that later.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I'm composer. You're forced to do things.
Yeah, and then if you're forcing it, then it might not, a lot of times it won't work and you won't be producing your best work. It just hit you up my final question. What was your favorite soundtrack on the episode that you didn't compose?
On this series, I don't know because I haven't seen them all yet. So I was saying, what have I seen? I've seen Common People, I've seen Playtest, and I haven't seen the other two yet because I've been stupidly under it. I enjoyed Playtest because it had a lot of like mid-90s electronic music. It wasn't really score, but it also features a video game magazine that I used to write for, which Charlie used to write for, because I used to be a video game journalist. So PC Zone gets a shout out. And they have the PC Zone office, which looks nothing like the PC Zone office in real life. But yeah, me and Charlie weirdly both used to work for the same video game magazine a long, long time ago. So I like that episode because it features 90s British video game scene, which is something that has a very soft spot in my heart.
Wow. Did you ever, when you had that sort of feeling of like hearing that sort of music from that time, I'm guessing it did transport you back.
Well, it's the whole thing. It's the world. It's the world they build. It's everything from the computers, the aesthetics, the mindset. There is, the character in that feels like a sort of weird cross between like Peter Molyneux, who I work with, and who designed Populous and Fable and games like that. And then sort of the gameplay looks a bit like Lemmings, like Dave Jones, and then it's got a bit of Alan Minter. Is that Alan Minter, the crazy Llama Soft guy? It's something it's like a lot of obscure people, but if you know who they are, you're like, oh, okay, yeah. This is seeing a world that you recognize that feels quite niche on screen is very satisfying and done well.
Interesting. It's, as I said, it's good to get this different viewpoint and you've kind of
Well,
opened my mind a lot more.
it's like wherever you live, Robert, it's like if you saw your street or your local shop or something in a film and something happening, and you'd be like, oh yeah, this is kind of cool. I know this. This is like my world. And so it's always interesting when you see a world or somewhere you grew up from I think that's always fascinating in a movie.
Well, where I grew up features heavily on road wars, so it comes up with a different sort of different vibe to yourself. But I totally get what you mean because when you see it, maybe in my case, in a really negative light, it does sort of bring a different sort of feel to it, and then also the music that they use is probably a little bit more sort of aggressive, being like, yeah, let's get the bad guys. But
Yeah,
it's still, yeah, it's funny though. I know what you mean. Daniel, thank you so much for your time today.
that's okay.
Um,
Uh, all right. Well, thank you for enjoying the show and the music, and I'm glad I've kept you alive somehow.
it's the journey that counts. But no, thank you so much for your time. Thank you again. You take care and bye-bye.
All right. See you later. Thanks so much. All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.